Thank you, Jack, for your ministry of music. The Ten Commandments are the only messages to men that God has written with his own hand. I'll make you think a little. It's a quote from D.L. Moody. The Ten Commandments are the only messages to men that God has written with his own hands. God's engraving of the Ten Commandments can be seen in Exodus 31:18, not our passage for tonight, but there's many passages that refer to them. In the book of Exodus, it says this in Exodus 31:18, and he gave to Moses, speaking of God, giving to Moses when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the two tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. That's what D.L. Moody is referring to, and we're going to come back to that text later in our study, but we are going to spend, as I said this morning, we're going to spend several studies in the Ten Commandments. I feel for myself to do them justice, need to take them more slowly rather than all at one shot, or rather half and half. I'm going to take them more slowly. Maybe sometimes we take a few at a time, but at least here at the start tonight, we are just taking the first. We're going to have an introduction to the Ten Commandments, but next several studies in Exodus will be devoted to the Ten Commandments. And I want to begin by reading the Ten Commandments for us. Our passage is Exodus 20, verses 1 through 3, but I want to read all the way to verse 17, and it's a larger passage, so to break it down, I've split them up into the individual commandments. So you're welcome to turn in your Bibles, or you can see it on the screen. I'll read for us the Ten Commandments found in the book of Exodus, Exodus 20, beginning at verse 1. It says this, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. And then the last three, you shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. That is the Ten Commandments. That is our text for the next several studies in this book. So as we begin this study, I want to begin with an overarching introduction, and then we're going to get to and spend the rest of our time on the first commandment. And the question I'll begin with is this. It's not clear in our, or at least the ESV translation, but it's the question of, should we even call them the Ten Commandments? Why do I ask such a question? Okay, we often call these the Ten Commandments. That's how we go by them. That's how I've been referring to them. But nowhere are they referred to as the Ten Commandments in the Scriptures. And more so, as I said, in the ESV, you'll see the Ten Commandments. But going back to the original language, the language of Hebrew, they are referred to as the 10 words. The 10 words. Okay, two texts. Our passage doesn't refer to them as the 10 words or 10 commandments. So we have to look at other texts that refer to them. Exodus 34, verse 28. It says this, so he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. It's literally the 10 words in the Hebrew. Same exact thing in Deuteronomy 4:13. Our translation says the commandments, it's the 10 words. It says, and he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, that is, the 10 commandments, the 10 words. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. So the 10 commandments is a fine way of referring to them. I'm not saying we have to revert to calling them to the 10 words. I just want to point out that these what we call commandments are literally the 10 words. These are commandments. These are things that God desired, he commanded for Israel. Another way you may hear of the 10 commandments referred to that isn't in the Bible, but you might hear it referred to as the Decalogue. Okay, this is from the Greek. Deca meaning 10, logos meaning word. So these 10 words or commandments were special. They were foundational words for Israel, and we're going to see in our study that they're not only important for Israel, but they're important for the Christian as well today. So 10 commandments, 10 words. Next, I want us to think about the special nature of these words. We see the special nature of these words in several different ways, and the first way I want to point out is that these 10 words were spoken directly from God to the Israelites. Okay, so this is kind of reverting back to what we looked at last week. Israel had arrived at the mount. They arrived at Mount Sinai. Moses had been going up and down the mountain. He was down from the mountain with Israel when God came down on the mountain. If you remember, with the cloud, with the fire, with the thunder, with the lightning. When God descended, Moses was down with the people. And Moses spoke, and God answered there. And then God called him up on the mountain, as it said in Exodus 19 through 20. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke. God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. Then it says this, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So Moses went up on the mountain. And last week we ended our passage by the Lord speaking to Moses. He tells him to go down to the people and share his words. That's how the chapter ended last week. So Moses went down to the people and told them. So Moses had been up on the mountain. Our chapter ended by him going down. So the point is that at this point in the narrative, as we're continuing on into this new chapter, chapter 20, Moses is back down with the people of Israel as Exodus 20 opens. This is where we find the 10 commandments given. Moses is not up on the mountain anymore. He's down with the people, so that when God speaks at the start of the 10 commandments, he's speaking to all of them. As it opens and says, and God spoke all these words, saying. He's down. Moses is down with the people, so God is speaking to all of Israel. The words to come, the 10 commandments, are what all the people get to hear. The fact that God had just spoken to the people, I think, can be seen in another place as well in later in chapter 20, and I alluded to this section just slightly as we closed last week, but I want to read it for us as I think it helps. It's not said directly, but I think we can see from the people's response after the 10 commandments that God had just spoken to them. It said this, after verse 17, after the 10 commandments are listed in Exodus 20, it says this, now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So the fact that this comes after we're told that God spoke the 10 commandments is one reason that I believe we can see that God was speaking directly to Israel as he spoke the 10 commandments. Additionally, okay, though it doesn't say they heard the words, the fact that the Israelites asked for Moses to speak to them instead of God speaking to them, I believe shows that he's just spoken directly to them. They've heard his very words. They've heard the Ten Commandments. They want Moses instead to relay God's words in the future rather than God himself like he just did. And then the third thing from this text, we're told there at the end that Moses, he went up to God once again, okay, showing that he had been down with the people while this is going on. If this was all we had, okay, there could be some grounds to question if they truly heard God speak. I could see people making an argument, did God really speak here? It's not said directly, or you have to piece things together. Well, there's more. Okay, there's more. Not in our passage, but we have to flip a few books over, and there's two passages that I think make it even more clearly. It says it outrightly, that God did speak to the Israelites in a unique way, and that is in the book of Deuteronomy. A little bit of lengthy passages, but I want to read them in full, as I believe they reveal that God had spoken the Ten Commandments to the people of Israel directly. It says this in Deuteronomy 4, 9 through 14. Only take care, so this is Moses speaking, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children, how on the day that you stood before the Lord, your God at Horeb, it's talking about Mount Sinai in Exodus, what we've been studying, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so that I may let them hear my words. But it goes on. And we see it fuller in verse 11. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom. It says this in verse 12. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the Ten Commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and rules, that you might do them in the land that you are going over to possess. So it says it pretty outrightly there that God spoke to them these 10 words, the 10 Commandments. But there's another passage as well in Deuteronomy 5, 22 through 27 makes it clear as well. And just for some context, this passage comes right after Moses has relayed or repeated the Ten Commandments to the people of Israel as they are preparing to go into the Promised Land. Moses speaks the Ten Commandments to them once again, and then he says this in Deuteronomy 5, 22 through 27. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness with a loud voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone, and he gave them to me. And as soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders. And verse 24 continues on, and you said, behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still live. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, we shall die. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as we have, and has still lived? Go near and hear all that the Lord our God will say, and speak to us all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear it and do it. So the picture is created in these texts of a dense, dark cloud, fire, and thunder and lightning taking place, a trumpet blast growing louder and louder. No one is on the mountain with God, or but God. Moses is down with the people, and God utters the 10 Commandments. These words that are before us in Exodus 20 that we're going to be studying were not spoken to Moses only, but to all the people of Israel. These words Israel got to hear with their very own 2 ears. God declares and commands directly to the Israelites these 10 words. Okay, so these words are special. Okay, they are unique in that God didn't speak the rest of the law to the people directly. He spoke it to Moses, who then carried it on and brought it to the people of Israel. The 10 words or the 10 commandments were spoken from God to the people. And the people, as we saw their reaction last week, we see it this week, they're scared. They're startled. They're in terror, so much so that they request a format change, that God would bring the words or would communicate his words to Moses instead of directly to the people. That's the setting of the 10 Commandments for Exodus 20. This is how they were spoken and what was going on as they were spoken. This is how they were first given. Okay, so how they were first given shows the special nature of these words. And another way that shows the special nature of these words is this, that they were uniquely recorded from the other laws and commands given. And this is how we actually began this evening by considering the quote from D.L. Moody. We're not told this in our passage, but the passage that I referred to, we see what is done then with the 10 Commandments that God had spoke. It had said, speaking of God, and he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. Okay, so at this point, it's not made clear that these are the 10 words, these are the 10 commandments, apart from the rest of the law that are recorded. Another passage we're going to look at shows this clearly, but we're told here that these words in specific are recorded on lasting material. Okay, it wasn't on material that could fade or be destroyed instantly, but it was on stone. Okay, stone that would last. It was not Moses who recorded these either, but it was God himself, as it says that they were written with the finger of God. He was writing them down. Another passage that highlights some of these things and also shows us where the 10 Commandments were eventually stored is Deuteronomy 10, 4 through 5. It says, "And he wrote on the tablets in the same writing as before the 10 Commandments, that the Lord had spoken to you on the mountain out of the midst of the fire on the day of the assembly. And the Lord gave them to me. Then I turned and came down from the mountain and put the tablets in the ark that I had made. And there they are, as the Lord commanded me." So I'm trying to show as we start that these 10 words are special. They are unique in what they are and as God revealed them. And the last thing I want to point out that makes them unique and important is that they stand out from the rest of the law. Okay, they are given, and then Moses goes back up and he gets the rest of the law. He gets the rest of God's commands and rules for the people of Israel. These commands are set apart. They are ultimately the basis for the rest of the law. They are given, and then in the verses to come, the other laws are given in Exodus. These 10 we should see as standing as a foundation for the rest of the law. They sum up the rest of the law. These sum up what it looks like to live an obedient life as God had began by calling the Israelites to at the start of Mount Sinai, as he had said this. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And then he said, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. What does it look like to obey God? To follow the 10 Commandments, to live out these 10 words for their lives. That is what obedience looks like for the Israelites. That's how they can be this treasured possession, this royal priesthood, this holy nation. Last thing I want to bring out in this introduction is for us to think about, how do the 10 Commandments begin? We've looked at God speaking and how these commandments are ultimately said. And now I want to bring attention to the very first thing God says. And we see that the 10 Commandments do not begin with a command. Okay, they don't begin with a command, but rather they begin with a reminder of redemption. Okay, some would actually take the verse we're about to look at and actually link it to the first commandment, which I think there could be There could be something to that. But at the very least, the way that we interpret it is the same. It's a reminder of the redemption that they had. In case there was any temptation to look at the rest of the list, the rest of what God was about to say, and say, if I keep these, then I can have a relationship with God. If I keep these, then I will be saved. If I can obtain these in my life perfectly, then I will have a relationship with God. If there was any temptation for this, the start shows this is simply not the case, because the very first thing God says to the people of Israel, as he says this, opening the Ten Commandments, it says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So God begins the Ten Commandments declaring who he is, what he had done. He declares that he's the Lord. I am the Lord. The name that God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, the name that revealed the self-existing God. He is the God who always is. He is the God who is their father's God. God reminds them of this as he says, I am the Lord. Then he says, your God. I am the Lord your God. He has shown that this is his people. He desires to be their God. This self-existing God desires to have a relationship with this people. And then this God has delivered them. He's rescued. He's liberated them from the Egyptians. He's taken them from life as a slave to life as his people. So it's God who saves them. It's God who has brought them to the place they stood. And now he's about to tell them how he expects them to live. He's going to tell them in these 10 words how he wants them to live. That is what the 10 Commandments are. Not a step-by-step list to obtaining a relationship with God. Neither is it a list that we should now just chuck because it's ancient, it's from years ago, but instead, this is a list that the Israelites and we are called to live by as God's people. And tonight we're going to just begin by cracking this list. As we continue to look at each of the commandments in future studies, we take just the first commandment or the first word this evening, and it is this. Exodus 20, verse 3, the first commandment is given. It says, you shall have no other gods before me. And just at the start of the study, I want to just bring out, it's not really a summary because it's longer than the verse or the commandment itself, but to give you in other words, this is a command for exclusive loyalty to Yahweh, to the Lord, as our God. Exclusive loyalty. So the point of the first command is exclusive, wholehearted, committed loyalty to Yahweh as our God. So I want to begin by fleshing this out by speaking of the meaning of this verse. The first command literally says, you shall have no other gods before my face or before my presence. Is what it means when it says before me. It's literally before my face, before my presence is what God is saying. So some take it to mean rather than before my face or my presence, that you shall have no other gods over me. Okay, some people take it as you should have no other gods above me or over me. I should be first place. But you can have other gods just so I'm number one. He's above them. That's not the meaning here. Not the meaning. Rather, the meaning is that God doesn't want to be one among many. He doesn't want to be one in addition to others. He doesn't even want to be one along with another. He wants to be their sole God, is what the command is commanding. He wants them to have one God and one God only, and He's it. He's it. The thought of this being before God's face or presence is an interesting way of putting this command. Okay, God's face, as it were, or his presence, is everywhere. Okay, he sees everything. He knows all that's going on. So what gods we can hide from others, what gods that you can worship in private, the gods we worship in our hearts that others have no clue of, God knows of them. They are before his face. They are before his presence, as this command speaks of. Waldemar Jansen, in his commentary, says concerning this commandment, he says, in effect, God is saying, take the other gods away. My presence does not tolerate other gods. So simply put, God wants to be their only God. So as we seek to understand what God says in this first commandment, that's the meaning, that's kind of an explanation of it. But I want to elaborate, and I want to give us what I think is a helpful illustration. And as I was studying these, and if you looked into it, there is a wealth of resources on the Ten Commandments, a lot of good ones. I've already spoken of D.L. Moody. He has a book. Another one I'm going to give here is Kevin D. Young, but along with a lot of the other commentaries I've been using for Exodus, there is a host of other great resources on this subject. So it really is a rich study reading up on all these things. So I want to give you an illustration that Kevin D. Young gives, and I'm going to quote him at length because I think it really helps us get a sense of what God is commanding here. And he compares your relationship with God to a marriage. Okay, relationship with God to a marriage. And I think it brings out what this commandment's given, and even it brings out the atrocity that is done when it's not followed. DeYoung says this, and I don't have it on the screen, so just listen, but I think you can almost picture this illustration. DeYoung says this, he says, marriage is a good analogy for the first commandment. You cannot have a both-and relationship with your spouse, at least not for very long. Suppose a husband came home and said, honey, it's good to see you. I want to introduce someone who's very special to me. Don't get me wrong, you're also very special to me, but I've met someone else. She's lovely, and I'm going to spend some time with her, but also a lot of time with you. I just want to let you know that some nights I'm going to be with her instead. I think you two will get along just fine. You'll be great friends. You both mean so much to me. He says, what should a wife say in this situation? That's great, dear. I'm honored that I can still be a part of your life. Hardly. Okay, the wife would say, DeYoung says, it's me or her. Make up your mind. And if the wife were to say that with a great deal of passion, would anyone think she was being cruel, proud, unfair, or intolerant? No. We would say that she's being just the sort of wife she ought to be. She has every right to be jealous. We'd be concerned if she wasn't angry. Some relationships are meant to be either or, not both, and marriage is a relationship that demands forsaking all others. And his point is that our relationship with God should be as well. So hopefully that kind of brings it out, even if you're not married. You know how a marriage works, and you get how that would not fly in a marriage. So marriage is a good illustration of what God is commanding here. Okay, we're not bringing any other God before him. We're not to take anything else that takes the place of God. We're not to be committed to one God, or we are to be committed to one God and one God only, just as a spouse is to be committed to one spouse and one spouse only. So the first command, again, as we find in Exodus 23, is, you shall have no other gods before me. Maybe as you look at this verse a little further and really zero in on the part that says, no other gods, might bring a question to your mind. Might bring a question to your mind, and even why this isn't phrased in another way. And that question is, does this command allow for the existence of other gods? Okay, God speaks of other gods. He doesn't directly or come right out to say that they don't exist, but he speaks of other gods. Are they alive? Do they exist? Is God one among many possible gods? But you must commit to him only. But there's other gods as options. I'll point out first that the first commandment is worried about who is getting their loyalty. Okay, who is getting their devotion, not how many gods there are. Okay, on the flip side, I do not believe that the first commandment is a statement that allows for the existence of God. As we see very soon in the Bible, Israel it's made known to Israel, and not that it hadn't been already, but it's said clearly in the scriptures and in what Moses was revealing to them. In Deuteronomy 4:39, it says this clearly, that only one God exists. Know therefore today and lay it to your heart that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. There is no other. Okay, so I believe this is the understanding as these commandments are given. We see it surely is as it's made known in Deuteronomy, as I said, as the people were preparing to enter the land, as Moses is speaking to them. So we see that there is but one God. This is what Israel was to believe. They weren't to think that their God was one among many, but he was the only one that should get their loyalty. Don't think that's the understanding. So why did God speak of other gods? Okay, why did he speak in this way? The reality is that in our world and in our hearts, gods can be created. Our hearts are pulled to give devotion to things other than the one true God. Our hearts can be pulled to treat someone or something as God, even though it absolutely is not. So this command is saying you shouldn't do so. You shouldn't go along with your heart's desire in this way. You should have no other gods other than Yahweh. And as we think about this first command, it's a command, as we think about Israel in the context here, it's a command for wholehearted devotion to God in the midst of a world with many gods. Not that they actually exist, but they were around. Other people served other gods. They were prevalent. Israel was moving out of a land filled with other gods. They worshipped false gods, and they were headed toward a land filled with other gods. And we see this succinctly, and I'll give it to us because it refers back and forward in Joshua, well-known text, but I'll highlight some portions that maybe aren't. In Joshua 24, 14 through 15, Joshua addresses the gods that they had known and the gods to come in the surrounding peoples. He says this, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So Israel would have been unique compared to other nations. Okay? Other nations would have had an assortment of gods that they worshiped, an assortment of gods as other options at their fingertips to treat as gods. Joshua brings it out. They're leaving a place that had gods plural. They're going into a place that has gods plural. They lived in the midst of a polytheistic world. Many gods that are worshipped and looked to. And the reality is, as we think about our world, we live in the midst of such a polytheistic world as well. And this leads to application. Let's begin with other religions. So as we think about applying this command to our lives, to our day and age, other religions, okay? There are other religions that worship other gods other than the God that we worship, the one true and only God, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. Okay, no other God in another religion is to be worshipped. No other God is to be worshipped alongside God. We aren't to come here and worship Yahweh and go to another worship place to worship another God. Just shouldn't be. Okay, there's even some today that would offer and encourage worshiping within a Christian church, worshiping God, but mixing it with practices, going to other worship places, and also partaking in some of their practices. This is disobeying the first commandment. It shouldn't be. Related to these things is religious pluralism, and what I mean by this is seeing two religions as being on equal grounds. Okay, you might not participate in that worship practice or the worship of that God, but you would say, I'm right, you're right. My religion gets me to have a relationship with God. Your religion gets you to have a relationship with God. This is disobeying the first commandment. Okay, going to the New Testament. I don't have the scripture up here, but extremely well known. Jesus, the Son of God, the God who is to be worshipped exclusively, says this in John 14:6, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Now let me address one more area For some, you might look at these last two options and say, not tempting. Not going to do it. It's not tempting to me. Well, let me give you an application that may be tempting. And that is for you to consider what is your God. And what I mean by this is what about those things that your heart is pulled towards to be devoted to give your time to trust in, to look for security from, to take priority over all other things. Things that we love and we adore above God. So it may not be a false god in terms of another deity or showing up to a place of worship, but it might be another person. It could be an activity. It could be a hobby. It could be an item. What is it that you are tempted to make your God alongside the one true and living God? Jesus said it plainly in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Is money a god to you? Okay, it's your number one pursuit. It comes before God. It comes before family. You do all you can get to get more and more money. It consumes your time as you seek to work in your pursuit of more and more money. It's your source of security. Okay? You got a lot in the bank account, you feel secure. If you don't, you feel weak. You feel unprotected. You feel like if something bad happens, you are at a loss. You're trusting in your bank account more than you are God. It's right up there with God. Rather than asking God to provide for you, you work or you seek money in other means. You're willing to do anything to get more money. So is money a god to you? Is pleasure your God? It says this in 2 Timothy 3:1-5. You see the money aspect, you see a self aspect, and you see pleasure at the end. It says this in 2 Timothy. But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So always looking for a good time, looking for momentary happiness. It could be sex, it could be TV, it could be experiences, it could be vacation. You're always longing for it rather than God. You're never content without this thing. You're not satisfied in God, but you believe this will satisfy you. Are you bowing down to the God of pleasure? Let's consider another God. Is it family for you? Family above everything, even God. Family is number one and God is second. God's commandments and words get thrown out the window in your defense of, you're standing up for your family. Does your children's desires and interests dictate your schedule or God? Do you adore your spouse over and more than God? Family is important, okay? The Bible makes that very clear, but it's not more important than God. Are you treating family as your God? These are just three options, okay? There are plenty more out there. Alcohol and sports, another person, a significant other, fashion, drugs, education, serving. Okay, the list can go on and on and on, so I'd ask you to just personally reflect and consider. You may worship God here on Sunday, but what is it that you worship throughout the week? What do you trust in? What determines your decisions? What is your time spent on? What does your life revolve around? What do you love more than God? Ultimately, these questions, God should be the answer to all these. Our trust should be in God. Our decisions should be based on God and His Word. Our time and our schedules should be centered around God. Our adoration should be on God. We can hide our gods in our hearts, okay? No one knows how much they consume your mind and your interests and your affections. No one knows how much you depend on this thing. No one knows how you love them. No one knows how much time you're spending thinking about them. No one knows how they guide your decisions except God. There before him, as we think back to the commandment, before his face, before his presence, he knows of your gods. He says, get rid of them. Get rid of them. This should not be the case. I am to be the only God in your life, is what this first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, is saying. So the question I'll leave us with as we close this evening, does God have your exclusive loyalty, or do you have other gods? Let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, I pray, as we think about our lives, as we think about our worship, Lord, it can be easy to worship you here on a Sunday and forget completely about you in the rest of the week. Lord, to be consumed with our lives and other things that we do tend to worship when we're real with ourselves, that our trust is in them, our adoration and our love and our longing is for them, our time and our schedules are revolved around these things. And Lord, I pray that you would reveal to us this evening what it is that we are treating as our gods. If it really is a religious practice of false worship, if it's wrong thinking about the way to you that other religions can lead to you, or if it's these gods in our hearts, these things that we are loyal to, we're committed to over and above you, or even alongside of you. Lord, I pray that you would reveal these, and Lord, I pray that you would help us to have a truer, a more devoted and a complete loyalty to you and you only. Lord, we can't do this ourselves. We can't see this ourselves, but I pray that you would reveal it. And Lord, bring repentance in these areas. And Lord, give us the strength to resist these things and move towards a more whole, a more exclusive worship and adoration to you. And in your name I pray. Amen. Thank you for joining us this evening, and you are dismissed.